Everyone in the village of Oakhaven laughed at the old man. Or worse, they looked right through him as if he did not exist. They called him a thief, a miser, a shadow of a man who stole the town's prosperity and buried it away in his secluded, drafty cabin deep in the weeping woods. They spat at his footsteps and whispered cruel warnings to their children whenever he walked by. That is, until the bitter, freezing morning they found his cottage completely empty, and the truth of a 40-year-old mystery finally came to light. Hello, my dears, and welcome. Come in from the cold and take a warm seat by the fire. The wood is crackling, the tea is hot, and I have a wonderful story to share with you tonight. If you enjoy stories that warm the heart and leave you with a valuable lesson, subscribe to Nanny Granny's Golden Tales and become part of our storytelling family. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading every comment. Let us travel back to a time when cobblestone streets echoed with the clatter of horse hooves, and the smell of wood smoke and freshly baked bread always hung in the crisp morning air. Oakhaven was a beautiful, bustling village, nestled deep within a valley surrounded by towering ancient pine trees. The people there were hard-working, proud, and deeply loyal to one another. But they were also incredibly stubborn, and they possessed memories that were as long and unforgiving as the harsh winter months that plagued their valley. The town's collective anger was directed at one solitary man. His name was Silas. Silas was an old man with a heavy, hunched back, a thick silver beard that remained perpetually untrimmed, and hands that were as rough and calloused as the bark of the trees he lived among. He wore clothes that had been patched and repatched so many times that the original fabric was entirely a mystery. He walked with a heavy limp, a physical reminder of a life filled with unseen burdens. Whenever Silas entered the village square to buy his meager weekly supplies, usually just a sack of flour and a few bruised apples, the bustling market would suddenly fall quiet. Mothers would quickly pull their children close to their skirts. The blacksmith would strike his anvil a little harder, and the baker, Mrs. Higgins, would scowl, tossing his bread onto the counter as if his very presence was an insult. You see, 40 years ago, Oakhaven suffered what the elders called the Great Loss. The village had been saving for years to build a sturdy stone bridge that would connect their isolated valley to the lucrative trade routes of the capital city. The money was kept in a heavy iron lockbox in the town hall. At the time, Silas was a bright-eyed young man serving as the trusted assistant to the beloved Mayor William. But one stormy night, the lockbox was found smashed open. The gold was entirely gone, and Silas was found kneeling beside it, his hands shaking, offering absolutely no explanation. The town was furious. A trial was held, but Silas simply kept his head bowed and refused to speak a single word in his defense. Because there was no hard proof of where he had hidden the gold, he wasn't sent to prison, but he was sentenced to something far worse. He was entirely outcast, banished to a crumbling cabin on the edge of the dark woods. Silas became the village's living ghost. Mayor William, deeply heartbroken by his assistant's apparent betrayal, passed away a few years later, leaving his son Thomas to take over as mayor. Thomas grew up harboring a deep, burning hatred for Silas, blaming him for the town's ongoing struggles and his father's early grave. But not everyone in Oakhaven looked at Silas with hatred. In a small cottage near the edge of the woods lived a 10-year-old girl named Elara. Elara was a curious, bright-spirited child with a heart full of boundless compassion. She didn't understand the complex grudges of adults. Where the grown-ups saw a bitter, thieving old hermit, Elara saw a lonely grandfather who walked with a quiet, gentle sorrow. One brisk autumn afternoon, Elara was playing near the edge of the woods when she saw Silas slowly making his way back to his cabin. As he walked, a sudden gust of wind caught his tattered coat, and a small object tumbled out of his pocket, landing softly in the tall grass. Silas, hard of hearing and struggling with his limp, didn't notice. He just kept walking, disappearing into the shadows of the ancient pines. Elara quickly ran over and knelt in the grass. There, nestled among the fallen autumn leaves, was a beautifully carved wooden bird. It was no larger than her palm, but the craftsmanship was absolutely breathtaking. Every feather was meticulously detailed, and the wood had been polished to a warm, glowing shine. It looked so lifelike that Elara almost expected it to open its little beak and sing. She took the beautiful carving back to the village, intending to show her mother. But as she ran past the bakery, Mrs. Higgins spotted the wooden bird. "Where did you get that, child?" Mrs. Higgins demanded, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Mr. Silas dropped it," Elara answered honestly. "I'm going to return it to him tomorrow." Mrs. Higgins gasped and snatched the bird from Elara's hands. "You will do no such thing. That man is a thief and a liar. He probably stole the wood just as he stole our future. Stay away from him, Elara. He carries a curse of greed." But Elara was brave. That night, when her house was quiet, she crept into the kitchen, took a fresh loaf of bread, wrapped it warmly in a cloth, and sneaked out into the moonlight. She bravely walked to the edge of the dark woods, guided only by the silver glow of the moon, until she reached the crumbling cabin. She quietly left the warm bread and the wooden bird on the old man's porch, knocked twice, and ran back home as fast as her little legs could carry her. The next morning, Elara found a tiny, beautifully carved wooden flower resting on her own windowsill. A bright, warm smile spread across her face. From that day on, a secret friendship bloomed in the shadows of Oakhaven. Elara would leave small gifts, a slice of cheese, a warm pair of knitted socks, a handful of sweet berries. In return, Silas would leave her magnificent wooden carvings, a leaping deer, a smiling bear, a delicate butterfly. But their innocent friendship remained a secret, for a terrible crisis was rapidly approaching Oakhaven. That year, the winter arrived with a brutal, unforgiving ferocity. It was a winter unlike any the village had ever seen. The snow fell in thick, blinding sheets for weeks on end. The river froze completely solid. The biting wind howled through the valley like a wounded beast, tearing shingles from roofs and freezing the water in the wells. And then, disaster struck. The old, rotting wooden bridge, the one the village had been forced to rely on because their stone bridge fund was stolen 40 years prior, finally gave way beneath the immense weight of the ice and snow. With a deafening crack that echoed through the entire valley, the bridge collapsed into the frozen river gorge below. Oakhaven was completely cut off from the outside world. The supply carts from the capital city could no longer reach them. The village's winter food reserves began to dwindle terrifyingly fast. Panic began to set in. To make matters worse, an incredibly contagious winter fever began to spread through the freezing homes. Children grew weak, and the elderly struggled to draw breath in the damp, freezing air. Mayor Thomas called an emergency town meeting in the Grand Hall. The villagers huddled together, shivering beneath thick blankets, their faces pale with worry and fear. "We are in a dire situation," Mayor Thomas announced, his voice trembling as he looked at his freezing people. "Our medicine is gone. Our food will only last another week. We need to hire builders to repair the bridge immediately, and we need to send riders to the city for medical supplies. But the town treasury is completely empty." A bitter murmur rippled through the freezing crowd. "If only we had the gold that old thief Silas stole," shouted the blacksmith. "We wouldn't be starving and freezing right now. We could have built a stone bridge that would have easily withstood this storm." Elara, huddled next to her mother, felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to stand up and shout that Silas was a good man, that he carved beautiful things and had a gentle soul. But she knew the angry, fearful crowd would never listen to a little girl. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like the video. It helps these stories reach more people who need a little inspiration today. The next morning, Elara woke up early. The snow had temporarily stopped falling, leaving a haunting, silent white blanket over the entire world. She packed a small basket with a meager piece of bread and a jar of hot broth, determined to check on Silas. The bitter cold was especially hard on the old and fragile, and she hadn't seen any smoke rising from his chimney for 2 whole days. She trudged through the knee-deep snow, her small boots crunching loudly in the eerie silence. When she finally reached his cabin, her heart sank. The front door was swinging wide open, banging harshly against the wooden frame in the freezing wind. "Mr. Silas?" Elara called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She cautiously stepped inside. The cabin was freezing. The small hearth was completely dark and filled with cold gray ashes. But what truly caught her breath was the sheer volume of things inside the small room. The cabin was absolutely filled from floor to ceiling with wooden creations. There were intricate clocks, beautiful rocking chairs, delicate music boxes, and hundreds of tiny, perfect toys. But there was no sign of Silas himself. As Elara searched the small room, her eyes fell upon a loose floorboard near the bed. It had been pried up, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. Inside the compartment was a heavy, rusted iron lockbox. It was the very same lockbox the village elders always described in their bitter stories of the great loss. Next to the heavy box lay a stack of thick, leather-bound journals. Elara slowly picked up the top journal. The pages were yellowed and fragile with age. She opened it and began to read the elegant, fading handwriting. As her eyes scanned the pages, Elara's breath caught in her throat. The words she was reading painted a picture so profoundly different from the terrible stories the village had told for 40 years. Her hands began to shake. She realized she held the absolute truth in her small hands, a truth that was bigger and more heartbreaking than anything she could have ever imagined. Without hesitating, Elara scooped up the heavy leather journals and the iron lockbox. They were incredibly heavy, but a sudden burst of pure adrenaline gave her the strength of a grown adult. She ran back through the freezing snow, ignoring the biting wind that stung her cheeks and the icy wetness soaking through her boots. She ran straight toward the center of the village, heading directly for the town hall, where the desperate villagers had gathered once again to pray for a miracle. Elara burst through the heavy double doors of the town hall. The sudden noise made everyone jump. All eyes turned to the small, shivering girl standing in the doorway, clutching a rusted iron box and a stack of old books to her chest. "Elara!" her mother cried out, rushing forward. "Where have you been? You could have frozen out there." But Elara gently pushed past her mother and marched straight up to the front of the hall, standing directly before Mayor Thomas. She placed the rusted iron box loudly onto the wooden table. A collective gasp echoed through the massive room. Every single elder in the village immediately recognized the intricate ironwork of the stolen town lockbox. "You found it!" Mayor Thomas shouted, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and vindicated anger. "You found the stolen gold! Where was it? Was it in that old thief's cabin?" "Mr. Silas is not a thief," Elara said, her young voice surprisingly loud and steady, cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. "And the box is completely empty." "Of course it's empty!" the blacksmith yelled from the back. "He spent it all, the greedy old fool!" "No," Elara commanded, holding up one of the heavy leather journals. "He didn't spend a single coin. I read his journals. I know the truth about what happened 40 years ago, and I think you all need to hear it. Especially you, Mayor Thomas." The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Elara opened the fragile book to the very first page and began to read aloud. Her voice carried across the quiet, chilly room. "October 14th, Elara read. "Tonight, my heart is utterly broken. Mayor William called me into his office weeping. His beloved wife, Thomas's mother, has fallen terribly ill. The doctors in the city demanded a massive fortune for the medicine that could save her life. In a moment of sheer desperation and blinding grief, Mayor William took the gold from the town lockbox. He traveled to the city, but it was too late. His wife passed away before he could buy the cure. Now, the gold is lost to the city merchants, his wife is gone, and he is a broken, defeated man." A collective gasp swept through the room. Mayor Thomas stepped back as if he had been physically struck, his face turning completely pale. "No," he whispered. My father was an honorable man." Elara continued reading, her voice unwavering. "Mayor William confessed his terrible sin to me. He said he was going to throw himself from the cliffs in shame. He couldn't bear to look into the eyes of the people who trusted him. But I stopped him. I told him that Oakhaven needed its strong mayor. A scandal like this would completely destroy the town's spirit. So I made a choice. I told him to wipe his tears, return to his home, and raise his young son. I took the empty lockbox. I smashed the lock, and I stayed beside it until the guards found me." Elara looked up at the crowd. Tears were silently streaming down the faces of several villagers. "Silas took the blame," she said softly. "He let you all hate him so that you wouldn't lose your faith in your mayor. He sacrificed his entire life, his reputation, and his future just to protect this town's spirit and a young boy who had just lost his mother." Elara then opened the second massive journal. But that is not all. Silas didn't just take the blame. For 40 long years, he worked in secret. He carved beautiful wooden furniture and toys. Every month, he would walk miles through the dangerous forest to sell them anonymously in the distant city markets. Elara began flipping through the pages rapidly, reading the meticulous entries. Year 5. Sent 50 coins anonymously to the town council to repair the orphanage roof. Year 12. Sent 100 coins to build the new medical clinic. Year 20. Sent funds to buy the new bell for the town square. She looked right at the stunned crowd. Every single anonymous donation this town has ever received over the past 40 years. It was all Silas. He spent his entire life working his fingers to the bone, living in freezing poverty, just to slowly pay back the money his friend had taken in a moment of desperate grief. The entire village stopped talking. The silence that fell over the great hall was absolutely deafening. It was a heavy, crushing silence, filled with an overwhelming wave of guilt, shame, and profound realization. The people of Oakhaven realized that for 40 years they had ruthlessly mocked, shunned, and hated the very man who had secretly been their greatest guardian angel. Mayor Thomas fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands as he openly wept. The baker, Mrs. Higgins, covered her mouth, her eyes wide with deep regret. But Elara wasn't finished. "Mr. Silas wasn't in his cabin," Elara said, her voice finally breaking. "The fire was completely dead. The door was blowing open. He is out there somewhere in this terrible storm, and he is old and incredibly sick. If we don't find him now, he will die." The heavy spell of shock was instantly broken. Mayor Thomas leaped to his feet, wiping the tears from his eyes. His face was set with fierce determination. "Ring the town bell," he roared. "Every man, woman, and child who can walk, grab your lanterns, grab thick blankets, grab hot water. We are not losing this man. We will not let him die in the cold." Within minutes, the village of Oakhaven transformed. Hundreds of golden lanterns pierced the terrible white darkness of the winter storm. The villagers marched into the deep woods, their voices echoing through the frozen trees, calling out Silas's name. They searched for hours, refusing to give up, their combined desperation pushing them through the freezing wind. Finally, it was Elara who found him. Deep in the woods, huddled beneath the thick, snowy roots of an ancient oak tree, lay Silas. He was covered in frost, his breathing terrifyingly shallow, his eyes closed. He looked so incredibly fragile, like a fallen leaf trapped in the ice. "Over here!" Elara screamed into the howling wind. Mayor Thomas and the blacksmith rushed forward. They gently wrapped the old man in layers of thick, warm wool blankets. Mayor Thomas, a man who had hated Silas his entire life, lifted the fragile old man into his strong arms, crying openly as he carried him back toward the village. They brought Silas straight to the mayor's own grand estate. They laid him in the softest bed, built a massive, roaring fire in the hearth, and the village doctor worked tirelessly through the night to brew warm broths and medicines. The entire town gathered outside the estate, standing in the freezing snow, holding a silent, hopeful vigil. 2 days later, the terrible fever finally broke. Silas slowly opened his tired, cloudy eyes. He was completely disoriented, finding himself not in his drafty, freezing cabin, but surrounded by warmth, soft pillows, and a gentle, crackling fire. Sitting beside his bed was Mayor Thomas, his eyes red and swollen from crying. When he saw Silas wake, Thomas slipped off his chair and knelt on the floor beside the bed. "Silas," Thomas whispered, his voice choking with heavy emotion. "We know. Elara found the journals. We know everything you did, everything you sacrificed for my father, for me, and for this entire village. How can you ever forgive us?" Silas looked at the weeping mayor, and then his eyes drifted to the doorway, where young Elara was standing with a bright, relieved smile. Silas reached out a trembling, calloused hand. and gently placed it on Mayor Thomas's bowed head. "There is absolutely nothing to forgive, my boy," Silas whispered, his voice raspy but filled with immense peace. "Love is not about keeping a tally of wrongs. Love is simply doing what must be done to protect the people you hold dear. I loved your father like a brother, and I loved this village. I am just so very glad to finally be warm." The village of Oakhaven was forever changed. When the snow finally melted and the spring arrived, they didn't just rebuild the bridge. They built a magnificent, towering bridge made of the finest stone, and across its grand arch they carved the words, "The Silas Bridge, built on the foundation of forgiveness and sacrifice." Silas lived the rest of his twilight years in the heart of the village. He never returned to the lonely cabin. He lived in a beautiful, warm room in the mayor's estate. He spent his days sitting in the sunlit town square, teaching Elara and the other children how to carve beautiful wooden birds, surrounded by the deep, unwavering love and profound respect of the people he had secretly saved. He had lost 40 years of his life to a lie, but in the end, he gained a legacy that would outlast them all. He taught a stubborn, bitter village the true meaning of grace, and proved that the brightest light often comes from the quietest, most hidden corners. And that, my dear friends, is why a kind heart is worth more than all the gold in the world. True wealth is not found in heavy iron lockboxes, but in the quiet, selfless sacrifices we make for one another, and the boundless capacity we all have to forgive. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Nanny Granny's Golden Tales for more timeless tales and endless wisdom. And tell me in the comments, what lesson did you learn from today's story? Good night, my dears, and stay warm.